All right, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our final speaker for today. My name is John Barry. I'm the president and CEO of Wings Over the Rockies here in beautiful state of Colorado. So we're going to start. Before I do the introductions for our guest speakers, could you go ahead and play the video, please?
Hello there, from the men in the moon. 10, 9, 8, 7, ignition sequence started. All engines are started. We have ignition. 1, 0. We have a liftoff. We have a liftoff that is lighting up the area. It's just like daylight here at Kennedy Space Center. The Saturn V is moving off the pad. It is now clear the tower. Roger, Gino, looking great. Thrusters are all fighting. Okay, babe, it's looking good here. Roll is complete. We are pitching. Stop push. Engine stop. Engine arm. Proceed. Command override off. Okay, Houston, the Challenger has landed. Jack, I'm out here. Oh my golly. Unbelievable. Okay. He's got down. No problem now. Okay. Attaboy. Okay. You look great. We're trying to slide around to the front of it, and every time we fire half thrusters, it tends to get under the front edge of the sunshade. Proceeded. 3, 2, 1. Ignition. On our way, Houston. Vector grid. X-Rock. Hit the order.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, was that a great beginning or what? Very good. So we're going to spend a week celebrating Apollo, but today, this session, we're going to celebrate the families. So we're going to provide the family perspective on what it meant to be associated with the Apollo mission. So as you know, and based on what you've already seen, I'm going to have the honor to introduce Barbara Cernan Butler and Sue Ragsdale Bean. Ladies and gentlemen, you're good. Now there's a few things you need to know about these women. They're Texas women, so don't mess with Texas. There you go. Now both were married to astronauts who walked on the moon. They are best of friends even today, living in Houston. They met for the first time, and they've been friends since about the 1964 time frame. They were Navy spouses. I would have preferred if they were Air Force spouses, but that's a different subject. Their husbands both flew twice in space. Now, Gene Cernan joined NASA in 1963 with Barbara. He flew on Apollo 10, which was the mission just before Apollo 11, and that is exactly the same thing that Apollo 11 did, except they didn't land on the moon. And again, he was the commander for Apollo 17, the last mission. So Gene Cernan was the last man to leave the moon and the 11th man to walk on the moon. Alan Bean was a backup for Apollo 9. He was the lunar module pilot for Apollo 12, so he was the next mission after Apollo 11. And he was also the commander for the Skylab 3. He was the 4th man to walk on the moon. So Gene Cernan was the 11th man and the last man to walk on the moon as of now. And Alan Bean was the 4th man to walk on the moon. Now the families. Barbara has 1 daughter, 3 grandchildren, and then has a great-grandchildren on the way. She met Gene when she was a flight attendant, and she's been in the import business for over 19 years. She married Dr. Max Butler. Unfortunately, he passed away a few years ago, but she has been an incredible volunteer in the community of Houston. Sue Bean has 2 children, a daughter and a son, 8 grandchildren and 3 great-grandchildren. So there's a legacy there. And she has been a teacher all of her life. She has spent 25 years in front of the classroom for young people. Now, what you're going to hear now is the adventures, the experiences, the very special moments from the family perspective and not from the astronaut perspective. You know, when I'm in the military for 30 years, people often came up to me many times and said, "Thank you for your service." Today, I want to thank both Sue and Barbara for their service, for having lived through these incredible, challenging times and helping their family exceed monumental accomplishments for the Apollo program. Good. So we're going to have them each speak for a little while, and then we'll open up for questions. So the first speaker for today is Barbara. Barbara, please come up.
Thank you. Good evening, or good afternoon, actually. Thank you all so much for coming and spending time with us. It's a pleasure. We've had such a wonderful time here, and John, thank you, and all the wonderful volunteers that have made this trip possible. Where's my little thing here? You know, there's a saying, if you can put one man on the moon, why can't you put them all? It didn't happen that way. They only put 12. And Sue and I are here representing 2 of those families. Gene Cernan, who was my husband, and Alan Bean, who was Sue's husband. I'm Barbara Cernan. I was married to astronaut Gene Cernan for 20 years. We met in 1959 when I was a flight attendant for Continental Airlines, which is now United. And he was a young Navy pilot based in San Diego. We got married there and lived there for about 4 months. And then we moved up the coast to Monterrey, where he was going to work on his master's degree. I remember in 1962, we were sitting in our living room when John Glenn took his, I guess that was his second flight, but took his big flight. Maybe that was his first. Anyway, we were watching television. We were just glued to the TV. And I looked at Gene and I said, "Would you like to do something like that someday?" He said, "Hell yes, I would." But he said, "I'm too young. I don't have enough flight experience." Those guys are all great test pilots. Well, little did we know that in just a couple of years we'd be standing in Houston among those wonderful gentlemen. We came to Houston in 1964, and we rented a home first, and we started building a home in Nassau Bay, which was near the Space Center. It was at that time that I met my wonderful friend, Sue Bean. We were all new to the program. We all came there at the same time, and Sue and I bonded immediately, and we began a friendship that's lasted 55 years. My daughter was 6 months old at the time, and her daughter was 3 months old. We pushed them all around the NASA area. They went to school together. They went to college together. They were sorority sisters, and then they were in each other's weddings. They are 3 months apart, and they each have daughters that are 3 months apart. There they are at the wedding. In 1966, Gene was assigned to be the backup crew for Gemini 9. And I remember he left home early one Monday morning, and I was busy vacuuming in my pajamas, and I got this phone call from him. And he said, there's been a terrible accident at the McDonnell Aircraft Company. He said our friends Charlie Bassett and Elliot C., who were the prime crew for Gemini 9, were killed. It was a terrible, terrible time for us. He told me, he said, get dressed real quickly and go down to Jeannie Bassett's home and be with her, which all the wives did. And it was like the second fatality we'd had in the program at that time. So he and Tom were immediately moved to the prime crew of Gemini 9, and they worked and worked and worked. And home hardly any, but they had such a tight schedule because it had to go on. The flight had to go on. I remember I was nervous at Gemini 9. I stayed home that time to watch the flight on TV. And I was so scared because everything had been so good before then. And I thought, oh, is it our time to have an accident or something? Well, my friend Roy Neal with NBC, he said, don't worry, Barbara, it's going to be great. Each flight builds on the success of the flight before. So we'd always had such good luck. Well, we had two delays on the pad. So the third time they tried to get off the pad, it went off, and it was great to see what we had liftoff. I don't know if many of you know much about Gemini 9, but Gene was supposed to do a spacewalk, and he had a new suit. They hadn't had spacewalks before. Oh, I had one. And he has suit. He realized when he got outside the spacecraft that they needed handholds to hold on to, because every place he held, if he turned the switch, his body went that way too. He went this way, his body went. So he was exerting a great deal of energy at that time. And his face mask, he had a new spacesuit, and the face mask started to fog over. At that time, he was essentially he was blind. He couldn't see anything. So after 2 hours, his heart rate was going crazy. The doctors were going crazy in Houston. After 2 hours, they made a decision to bring him back in the spacecraft. And he always referred to that as a spacewalk from hell. We went from that. In '69, we flew on Apollo 10, which we just celebrated 50 years. And the flight was the dress rehearsal, as John mentioned, for the lunar landing on Apollo 11. This crew was the first time that everything was broadcasted in color. And they won an Emmy Award. We got to go to Hollywood. In December of '72, Gene flew on Apollo 17. It was the first night launch, and it was just so beautiful. And it was the last manned mission to the moon. People always say, well, what do you do while your husband's in space? Well, pray a lot. You cry some. You take care of everything that's left behind. All your household duties, pay the bills. You learn to mow the grass. You learn to do all that stuff. But you're surrounded by your friends and your family, and that keeps you going. We were all a group of women, all from different walks of life, but we had a common goal, and that was to support our husbands, take care of our families, do all these household chores, and be responsible. After the Apollo program and the Skylab and the Apollo Soyuz mission ended, many of our friends left and moved from the area. This happens to be a picture of us at splashdown. I'm slow with this. We formed a group. Our wives formed a group because we'd all become friends. And we called our group KIT, K-I-T, which means keep in touch. We wanted to keep our friendships growing, and people were moving all over the place. The first place we had our reunion was at Jan Armstrong's home in Utah. It was in 1991. Before I left, Gene said, "I'd love to be a fly on that wall." Good thing it wasn't. We had such a wonderful time. Many of us were divorced by then. We just talked about everything, talked about our heartaches and our disappointments. And after 3 days, I felt that we'd all become a lot closer. We weren't competing for anything any longer. Since that time, we've gotten together 11 times over the years, and each time it's gotten better. The second get-together that we had for our wives was in Houston in the NASA area. So a lot of people, like I said, had moved away. They were all anxious to come back to NASA, so we had it there. And Gene said, he always loved all the wives, and he said, "I'm going to buy all the wine. Now y'all just you plan the party, and I'm buying all the wine." Big mistake. He ended up paying every time we got together for the next 25 years. He was sick in the hospital just a couple of years ago when he wrote the last check for our reunion number 9. Now, I have to tell you that all these reunions were for first wives only. We didn't allow the second wives. We consider our group very special, and it'll always be that way. We just returned from our last number 11, which we held it at Gene's Ranch in Kerrville, Texas, that now belongs to my daughter. And this year, we decided to include our daughters in the get-together. We had such a great time. We had over 30 people there, and we had a special memorial service for all the wives who had gone before us. It was just really, really beautiful. And selfishly, we had a special memorial for Gene at the same time. I know he was smiling down, glad that we were all there. We lived a great life. We had good times, we had bad times. We watched our friends get divorced, die. But we had to continue going forward because we were in a race to the moon. That's our last wives. We traveled all over the world. We were on trips to for the State Department, creating goodwill for the country. After Apollo 17, our crew went around the world beginning on the Ivory Coast of Africa, and we continued around the equator for 29 days. I think at that time we slept in like 25 different beds. It was exciting, it was educational, but it was really very tiring. You would get dressed early in the morning and for a presentation of some sort. Then you'd go on to lunch. Then you'd rush home to the hotel, shower, get ready for a black tie dinner. And we didn't have a lot of money at that time. So it was not easy dressing for all these trips. The State Department would tell you that you couldn't wear a certain color in certain countries. Don't get too low cut. Try to be conservative, keep yourself conservative. Well, when you have a limited wardrobe, sometimes that's not the easiest thing to do. I remember we were in Taiwan. We had a formal dinner with President Chiang Kai-shek. The only evening gown I had left was a little low cut. I was trying to figure out how to adjust the bust, make it a little more conservative, and Gene said, "Oh, forget it. You look great. Don't worry about it." Well, Chiang Kai-shek was a very small man. He came about right here. I was the hit of the evening. A lot of people ask you, well, what was one of the most significant meetings you had during your travels? And I say, for me, meeting Pope Paul VI was one of my greatest remembrances. We were on our way to Russia, and we stopped at the Vatican. We had a wonderful private tour, and then we were escorted into the Pope's chambers and had a private tour with him. He was so sweet and so kind, and it was like he was as excited to meet us as we were to meet him. Well, during our conversation, he told Gene, when Yuri Gagarin was a Russian cosmonaut who walked in space the first time, and he told Gene, he said, you remember your comrade said, I was in the heavens, but I saw no God. And Pope Paul said, tell him that just because he didn't see the God, any God at all, it didn't mean he wasn't there. So when we left the Vatican, we were reflecting on our meeting, and we commented on what Pope Paul had said, and I think it has stuck with us all this time. I remember Gene saying when he came back from his first trip, well, I'm forgetting to push these buttons, I'm sorry. There's the Pope. When he came back from his first trip on Gemini, he was so far away from the Earth, and he looked back at the moon, looked back at the Earth, to where his home was, where everyone he loved was, and he reflected on the fact that the world was just too beautiful to have happened by accident. He felt someone bigger than us had put it all together. At that moment, I do believe his faith was a little strengthened. And now when I look up at the moon, I know he's there somewhere in the heavens. In my mind, I picture him on the moon, looking down over Tracy, myself, our grandchildren, making sure we're safe. After coming home from the moon, he told me that he was standing on the surface, looking back at the Earth. He felt he was on God's front porch. So perhaps that's where they all are now. I hope he saves me a seat. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you.
I wanted to know this. Thank you.
No, that's good.
I live right over.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, Sue Beam.
I want to thank you for the invitation to be here today. I have always felt it an honor to be a part of the space experience and NASA's effort to make the giant leap to the moon. The landing was the endeavor of many dedicated Americans. It became very personal to me and my family when my husband entered the astronaut program. It enriched our lives and challenged us to be better people and Americans. I think it did the same for our country. For all those years, I am grateful. For Alan and me, our journey to NASA began on the campus of the University of Texas in Austin in 1951. Alan and I were both gymnasts at the University of Texas and were on the gymnastic team, and that was how we met. About the seventh meet into the year, we were sitting on a tumbling mat, and he said to me, "Save me a seat," and we both saved each other a seat for the next 25 years of our life. I was a Texas cheerleader, so football was fun. We spent our mornings in classes and some afternoons went to the drag along the strip of the university on the side and went to the jukebox in the cafe and danced. Girls at that time lived in girls' dorms and boys were in boys' dorms. So 3 or 4 nights a week we had a Coke date at 10 o'clock, but girls had to be in at 11. Alan was a dedicated aeronautical engineer student and a member of the Naval ROT. He had a scholarship. He graduated in January 1955, and we were married in the spring of '55. I went on to finish my degree and did my student teaching and joined him when he received orders to flight training in Pensacola, Florida. We finished flight training and our first duty station was Jacksonville, Florida, and he was in a squadron flying A-4Ds in the Navy. We spent 3.5 years there in Jacksonville. I always considered him, as the Navy says, top gun as a pilot. From there, he went to test pilot school and was in test pilot school at Pax River, Maryland. And then he served in service test there at the Naval Air Test Center. They tested every plane that the Navy received to go into the fleet before it went into the fleet. So along about late 1962, he had a letter from the Navy saying, would you be interested in joining the astronaut program? We talked it over and he said yes. So he headed for San Antonio where they did the flight and mental physicals. The thing that they asked him to have, which he did, was 2,000 jet hours, be under 6 feet tall, and have an engineering degree. And one afternoon, meanwhile, we received orders again to the fleet, went back to Jacksonville, Florida, and one afternoon when he came home from work, he was working in the yard, and he received a telephone call from Deke Slayton saying, hey, how would you like to join us in Houston next week? You've been selected as one of the 14 third group of astronauts. And this is the third group of astronauts. Our orders were to be in Houston on January 1964. So we were very happy to return. We were both native Texans. He had grown up in Fort Worth, Texas, and I'd grown up in Dallas, so it meant our families would be nearby. At that time, we had a son that was 7.5, and our daughter Amy had been born. She was about 3 months old. One of the developers rented us a home for a year until we could decide where we were going to live. At that time, this is when I met my dear friend Barbara. The senior member of our group, I'm now ahead of my slides. The senior member of our group was Dick Gordon. Dick had been stationed with us at Pax River along with Pete Conrad. Both men flew with Alan on Apollo 12. Dick organized an afternoon social where we all got together, and that was where we met the first families. As Barbara told you, we bonded immediately. We rode our babies in the baby buggy together, and they grew up together. I think you saw this slide on a trailer that the girls made for us. This was the astronaut wives in late 1964. You can all see we wore hat and gloves at that time. There's 3 of the original 7 wives were still in Houston. This was our first home that we began to build in Nassau Bay, which was a subdivision directly across from Johnson Space Center. This is Alan and I and our son Clay and Amy. When she was about 3 years old, we moved into our home. Barb and I shared babysitting together, and these are a picture of our daughters at their first Halloween when they were 3 years old. One of the things I wanted to talk about, which was never a fun thing to review, was the loss of the Apollo 1 crew. In early January of 1964, Gemini was over and the crew had been selected. One Friday afternoon, Alan happened to be in the astronaut office, and he gave me a call and said, Sue, there's been an accident at the Cape. There's been a fire. I want you to go to Martha Chaffee's home immediately. All of us lived in the 14 group within about 2 or 3 blocks of each other. Martha lived next door to Barbara Cernan. So I immediately took my daughter Amy to my friend next door and said, would you watch her for me? I have to go to Martha's. As I came up on the porch of Martha's, Mike Collins was joining me. I did not know the results of the accident, and I saw Mike's face. We rang the doorbell, and Martha came to the door. He immediately said to Martha, "I need to talk to you." So I waited, and when they came back from Roger's study, they told me that there was a fire on the Cape and the guys didn't get out. They were breathing 100% oxygen. There was something in the electricity that gave a spark, and they couldn't get out of the spacecraft. So for 2 years, the program was shut down. All of the 400,000 people that had worked together to start Apollo went back to the drawing boards, and they came up with a safer spacecraft. The first mission was Apollo 7, and then there was 8, 9, 10, and the final mission for the moon was 11. This is a picture of Martha and Barbara and I at Tracy's ranch in Arizona a few years ago. We remained friends, of course. We were close friends at the time. And this next slide was from my combination of slides, was the splashdown with Pat Collins at her home for Apollo 11. Most of the astronauts' day of splash time, we always brought a potluck, and when splashdown and the guys were safe, we opened a bottle of champagne. Apollo 12 came up in November, scheduled for November 14th, 3.5 months later after Apollo 11. Our husbands always left for the Cape about 3 months early for training. Of course, they'd been into so much training previous to all of these flights. They were usually never home during the week. They left on Monday morning and returned on Friday afternoon. There was desert survival, jungle survival, training of the rocks of volcanics in Hawaii, and then there was all the sims they were running for each flight, which they had all the emergencies given to them. The Apollo 11 patch, each crew designs their patch, was an early American ship coming around the moon called the Yankee Clipper. In the background, you see 4 stars. 3 of those stars were for Pete, Dick, and Alan, and the other star was for C.C. Williams, who had been on the flight originally but had been lost in returning from the Cape in one of the planes they were flying, the T-38s. The day before the flight was an off day. The children and I flew to the Cape, and we rented an apartment. We were staying in adjoining apartments to Barbara and Jean and Tracy, and Jean was my main astronaut to take me out to the Cape. But it was an off day. The guys had done everything. Alan called me and said, "Drive out to the Cape. I want to show you a few things." Well, it was one of the more interesting days in my life. The first thing we did was we went to the simulator for the limb. We crawled in. He said, "Sit in my chair, in my seat, put on the earphones." He said, "I'm going to fly us to the moon." So he said, "Look out the window. You're going to see the same thing we see as we're going down." We left the Yankee Clipper, and we started down for the moon. I was watching the moon come up in front of us. It told me how many feet we were off the moon, and then we landed. And of course, it was a great experience, because normally the wives, we didn't go out to the Cape. I mean, we didn't see everything because the guys were too busy training. So as we left the simulator, he said, "Now I want you not to worry." He said, "We have 3 backups for every system." He said, "Everything except the limb." And he said, "That rocket has worked 99% of the time." I wasn't worried. He trained 7.5 years for this flight. It was his dream. I knew he was a very capable individual. Next morning, Barbara and Jean and Tracy and my family, my parents, and a few friends, we headed out to the Cape. The families had a special place they watched. Jean was my key astronaut, who was telling me everything that was going on. This picture is Amy, my daughter, my son Clay, my mother, and it was raining. The day before, it had been slightly raining, and I said, "Okay, you think we're okay for launch?" And his reply was, don't worry, the helicopters will be flying. They're going to tell us if we're okay for launch. Well, the spacecraft took off, and just about that time, two shots of lightning came down on the ground. I looked at Gene and said, Gene, is everything okay? Oh, yeah, let's go back to the Cape, beat the traffic, get in the car, we're going. He was listening on the earphones as we're going back, and of course we were all chatting together. And as we got back to our apartment, he said to me, I hate to tell you this, but the spacecraft got hit by lightning and it took out all the electricity. When Alan came home, he said to me, oh yeah, that was a great experience. He said, we were all test pilots. We don't do anything for a second. And then he said, Pete and Dick looked at me. I was in charge of the electric and said, you have it, Al. He said, thank goodness I remembered a sim, which switch I was supposed to pull to get the electricity. So he did, and they relined the gyros, and they were off to the moon. This was actually the night of splashdown. Took about 4 days to get to the moon. These were my neighbors. It was about 11:45 at night when they landed on the moon. And of course, they were all telling me we're patiently waiting for the lunar landing. They landed safely, and unfortunately, Alan had turned one of the cameras toward the sun, and it took it out, so we didn't have any TV during that time. This is when Alan went down the ladder, or maybe it was Pete. And then everything went great. They went out on the moon twice. He did tell me, Lawrence, that they had a little bit of a problem with Pete's suit. When they were, I don't know if you ever heard this story, but it was a suit that was his practice suit. And he had gained a little bit of weight, so they had to get him in that suit. But that was usually about an hour's job to just get him in the suit, and go out on the lunar surface. This is splashdown day. The children and I went out and met the press, and I was very happy when Alan came out of the capsule, and they picked him up. And then I went over to Barbara Garden's house, which was just around the corner, and the three of us were there and went out to showed up our signs for the press. And then this is another photo of later at Barbara's house when Jan and Neil joined us after the flight. Then Alan was in quarantine for about 14 days. They came back, and one of the things he had said to me, he'd call me from the ship as soon as he was able to. And I said, what's going on? And he said, well, a camera hit me in the head. The doctor's sewing up my head. But he said, I'm really hungry. He said, be sure when I get back to Houston, you bring me some home cooking, especially spaghetti and meatballs. That was his favorite. He wasn't a fan of space food. He was a picky eater. He lost 13 pounds on the flight. And I guess it was all the energy that they were using in the suits and just the fact he didn't eat very much. The festivities, there was a great parade in Fort Worth, which was Alan's hometown. They had a ticker tape parade for the children and our family. The next weekend was very, very special. We were invited to the White House by President Nixon to spend the night at the White House. NASA rented 3 limousines for us because they said that was what was the protocol. So we flew up on the NASA Gulfstream that morning, on Saturday morning, and we got there, and President and Mrs. Nixon met us at the back door. He showed us all around the White House and took us into his office and shared all of his things there with us. And then they said, well, it's time for us to show you your quarters. So we had quarters on the 3rd floor, which was there where they had guests, and his daughters also had their rooms there. That evening, we were supposed to meet at 6 o'clock we were having dinner in the private quarters. So we were there at 6 o'clock, and as we sat there and the conversation began, he had called the Vice President, Lyndon Johnson, and he invited us to come to the ranch at a later time. And then he told us, he said, now I'm sending you on a world trip. On Apollo 11, flags were carried of every country. And also flags of all the states were carried in the U.S. territories. The 11, 12, and 13 crews took these flags back to the countries and presented them in the name of peace. So in March of that year, we left on a trip around the world. We went to 20 countries, and we were on Air Force Two. It was certainly the trip of a lifetime, because each day, the State Department that was with us, about 7 members, briefed us on the customs of the country, gave us a stack of cards so that we didn't make a mistake on the culture of the country. At the White House that night, something happened to me. I had an upset stomach. So I realized as we were in the living room that I was getting ill, and I told Mrs. Nixon, I think I'm going to have to go back up to our room. I don't think I can make dinner. Well, she was so kind to me. She immediately took me by the hand. We walked across the hall, and she took me into a bedroom, and which was the Lincoln bedroom. All of the furnishings went back to the 1870s. Some of them were from Lincoln's furnishings of his. I got sick, and I went to the adjoining bathroom and lost everything I had the day in the sink. She reaches over, turns on the sink, and says, "Honey, don't you worry, my girls get sick when they're traveling. You just lie down in this bed right here. I'm going to leave you for a little while, and I'm going to come back and get you." Well, as it happened, she sent the White House doctor up. He gave me a shot, settled my stomach, but also made me very sleepy. So I wasn't able to attend the dinner that evening. I went back to our room. But the next day was a great day. He had invited the members of his cabinet and family to join all of us in a Christmas brunch. It was December 13th, 1969. This is just a picture of the world trip in Ceylon as we were met off of the Air Force Two, and it's now Sri Lanka. Alan's next flight was Skylab 2. Skylab had 3 missions in it, and they were Earth orbital missions. His particular flight was the study of, I'm going back. His particular flight was the study of the sun, and it was also looking at man's body, how it was going to perform. It was 59 days long. He was in the second Skylab mission. This is at the Cape, the 3 wives, Gracia Lausma, Helen Mary Garriott, and my children at that time. Clay was 16 and Amy was 9. I wanted to share this with you. This is as I was going over my files. Alan was a great communicator in letters. He always wrote to us a very special letter before each flight, the night before he launched. And this one was to my son, who was 16 at the time. "Dear Clay, I'm thinking of you now. It is some 2 hours before we get up to launch on Skylab. I want you to know I love you very much. I'm very proud of the way you did in school last year, and especially in Outward Bound. You are now a man, and I love you. Take care of Mom and Amy." I just thought it was a special message from a father to a son. This was their Skylab patch. It's Leonardo's da Vinci drawing of man, because it was the study of man's body in space, and the sunspots and the Earth in the background. Oh, and forgot this one. This was our wives' patch. It was kind of a joke. We didn't tell the husbands. We had an artist draw up a nude woman, and we put our names on it: Sue, Helen Mary, and Gracia. Deke Slayton, we asked him if he would put it in a spacecraft for us. He put it in the spacecraft unknown to our husbands, and they saw it their first meal. This is coming home after 59 days. We didn't go out. We never went out to the ship. They were coming into Ellington Air Force Base, and we dressed up in old, early American costumes. And Gracia had a friend that had this car, so Deke drove the car, and we went out to meet them. Now, this is Alan. We were divorced, unfortunately, late in 1976. The times that they were away were long, and it didn't make for good personal relationships after about 18 years. So Alan decided to stay at NASA. He became head of the astronaut office for the next 8 years. But he was always an artist. From the time we were first married, he made our furniture when we decided to furnish an apartment. At Pax River, he took art lessons at St. Mary's University. When he had the extra time, he painted. In Houston, he had his paintings set up in the den, his easel, and he said to himself, you know, I want to paint what I saw on the moon and what my fellow astronauts saw. Many of his friends in the astronaut program couldn't believe that that was what he was going to do. But when he retired from NASA, he started painting. This is one of the final pictures he passed away in 2017 in May, at the end of May. And this is one of the pictures that Amy, my daughter, wanted me to show of her dad. This was the hammer he carried on the moon. The story about the hammer was, one day after his flight, he was sitting in his office, and one of the suit fellows came in and said, "Hey, Alan, this hammer was in your pocket. Would you like to have it?" So he said yes, and there was a small container of lunar material dust in the container. And he said that hammer laid there for a number of years till he retired, and then he took it to his home where he had his studio. And he always said to the children, you know, I was an astronaut, but I was really an artist. I was an artist longer than I was an astronaut. And he did, for the next 30 years, he did some wonderful paintings of the moon. This is a special painting. When Gene was on the moon, he wrote Tracy's initials. And so when he came back, one day, Alan was visiting with Gene in his studio. I'm ahead of myself. And he said to Gene, I'm going to do a painting of this. And Gene said, yeah, I wish I'd have written Tracy's name. And Alan said, we'll just change that, and it won't cost the taxpayers any money. I'll write it in. Okay. I've lost it. I'm hitting the wrong button. Okay. This is my family at the service in Houston, my son's family. I have 2 children, 8 grandchildren, 3 great-grandchildren. My daughter's family. This is Barb and I, not too long ago. We experienced many, many things together. We raised our children. She knew all of my family very well. And we skied together. We rode bikes together in Colorado, down Vail Mountain. And we always give each other a phone call each night, and usually have lunch with friends in Houston about once a week. Alan and Gene discussing something in Alan's studio in later life. And these are our patches and our friends. I'm going to let you close, Barb.
Go back to the picture of Gene and them.
Okay, back to that.
The one of them.
Okay.
Well, thank you. We hope you've enjoyed this presentation. We've given you a little bit of an insight of what it was like. We might have talked about our ex-husbands too much, but they were our friends, and they were the fathers of our children. I hope it's given you a little bit of an insight of what it was like. We had the most wonderful life. Sue and I were talking. We shared in this adventure, one of the greatest adventures in this century, and we were so happy to have been a part of it, that God gave us this opportunity, and that NASA gave us, and that Gene and Alan gave us this opportunity. I'm going to leave you with one quote that I told a reporter one day. If you think going to the moon is hard, you ought to try staying home. Thank you so much.